If there's one phrase which is designed to provoke paroxysms of anger and denunciation from everyone, from right-wing liberals through to very, very extremely left-wing anarchists, is the phrase democratic centrism. It's a phrase which, if you're to believe all the critics of the Bolshevik tradition, is responsible for the rise of Stalinism. This is, of course, accusation that democratic centralism, as practiced in the Bolshevik Party during Lenin's time, is the cause of Stalinism, is given increased power by the fact that, of course, what remains of the ruling Stalinist parties, I should say, what remains of the ruling Stalinist parties in the USSR, China, and elsewhere, claim that they act according to the traditions of democratic centrism. What I want to argue today is if you actually look at the reality of the practice of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party Bolshevik faction between 1903 and 1921, you'll find that the idea that this somehow was the progenitor, the heir of the sort of party that Stalin created in the late 1920s and cemented together in blood in the 1930s is absolute rubbish. Any idea that the organisation of democratic centralism leads to Stalinism falls apart. To start, and from that something else that also is very important to understand, that I want to argue also that you cannot talk about an effective revolutionary organisation in the world today, anywhere in the world, if it doesn't, whether it recognises it or not, abide by principles similar to those of democratic centralism under the Bolsheviks. If a revolutionary party understands that it follows the tradition of Leninist democratic centrism and it's a great gain, if it operates without understanding it, operates to some extent blindly, it's a great loss. Now let's start by looking at the myth. You see, the myth is that in 1902 and 1903, this mad fanatic, Lenin, took over the Bolshevik Party, foisted his way upon the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, pushed his way through a conference at which he didn't have a Congress at which he didn't have a majority, proclaimed himself as the majority at the end of it, and then proceeded to establish a dictatorship of professional revolutionaries who dictated to the working members of the party. And this is always done upon that this argument is based on taking one text which Lenin wrote in this period, the text, what is to be done, and taking from it certain phrases. The phrase that the party has to consist of professional revolutionaries. The phrase that the party brings socialist consciousness to the working class from outside. The working class never spontaneously achieves socialist consciousness. These phrases are put together and it said, look, Lenin dictated, it built up a dictatorship in the party in 1902, 1903. This party took power in Russia in 1917. Lenin established dictatorship in Russia in 1917, and Joe Stalin was the logical continuer of everything that Lenin was doing. Now, if you actually look at the reality of how the Bolshevik Party was built through this long period, the reality is very, very difficult. First, this text, what is to be done? People say Lenin wrote it, which is true. What they don't say is who supported it. Who supported it when they went to the Second Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party? A man called Martov supported it. A man called Dan supported it. A man called Trotsky supported it. Virtually the whole range of the people who were later to be the core of the Bolshevik Party, also came to be called the Menshevik Party in Russia from 1903 onwards, supported what was to be done. They argued and they quarrelled, and I'll come back to this later, over the implementation of what was to be done. But why do they support it? What do they think about professionalism? The fact of the matter is, you were faced in Russia in the beginning of the present century with what had been a rise of lots of little socialist groups in different parts of Russia. Most socialist groups lasted 4 or 5 months before they were infiltrated by the Tsarist secret police and their members, not just their leaders, all their members, were cast off to Siberia. In that situation, what wanted to be done was how do we overcome the amateurism, which enables our organisation to be broken up again and again and again. Lenin issued a call for professionalism. If anyone in that situation wants to say professionalism isn't important, they should have told it to the Russians then. Also, they should tell it to people trying to build underground socialist groups in South Korea or in Taiwan or in Latin America, in Chile under Pinochet and so forth. The idea that you can have amateurish methods, that anyone can turn up at a meeting any time they want to. What you find is you talk to people who've been involved in underground groups, for instance, no one ever turns up to a meeting late. You don't turn up a minute early, you don't turn up a minute late. You go to meet someone, you meet someone on time. So our professionalism in that situation is not some sort of aberration, it's built into the situation you're in. And Navid, one of our comrades, went to a foundation conference of the Russian Socialist Party 2 weeks ago, and he came back and he said he should understand why Lenin went on about professionalism in 1903, looking the way the Russian socialists try to organise now, because they haven't learned the ABC of how you get things together, organisation and so forth. For us today, it's always quite when you're underground. If someone says, the SWP want a professional organisation, it don't mean we want an organisation of full-timers. What we mean is we want an organisation which, if you say something's going to get done, it gets done. You don't waste your time piddling around, messing around, ruining meetings, turning up late. The sympathisers of the party turn up at the meeting at 8 o'clock, the non-members turn up at 8:30, which does unfortunately happen all too often. You have to move, you have to do it. If you're talking about a situation of serious struggle, if you're building your influence inside the working class movement, you have to talk in those terms. The second thing is then it goes on, it goes not in the concrete situation, which Lenin began to reveal, which the people around Lenin began to the Bolshevik Party. It also ignores the actual history of the party after 1900, because it's not true. It was built up as a hermetically sealed, dictatorial organisation under Lenin's control. You just have to look at what happened in 1905. In 1903 and 4, the closest thing to Lenin in building the party was a man called Bogdanov. Bogdanov, who apparently at that time was a very good organiser, I don't know if it's true or false, very, very keen on building professionalism, getting things done right, and so on and so forth. Comes the 1905 revolution, what happens? Lenin falls out with Bogdanov. Over what? Now, people sometimes tell you Lenin fell out with Bogdanov over the question of philosophy, God building, and so on and so forth. No, he fell out with Bogdanov because Bogdanov didn't understand that when you talk about the movement being at a very, very low ebb, of course, to a certain extent, socialist ideas can come from outside the working class. If today you go to, say, the Romanian miners, who've just been involved in anti-gypsy pogroms in the streets of Bucharest, and you go and say, unity of the working class, Romanians, gypsies, Hungarians unite together against the Ionesco regime, those ideas are coming from outside the working class. If you talk about a high level of struggle, in which people are fighting together on the picket lines, on the barricades, you'll find those slogans arise spontaneously. And Lenin said to Bogdanov, really, you don't understand. The struggles jumped forward, leapt forward after the massacre outside the Tsar's palace, the Winter Palace, in 1905. You don't understand. The whole movement's leapt forward. Let's recruit. We have to recruit. On every party committee, we have to have 5 workers to every professional revolutionary. A couple of months later, he says, 5 workers isn't good enough. We need 50, 100 workers in every party committee for every professional revolutionary. The working class is spontaneously social democratic. He meant revolutionary, and then hastened to add. And it's taken 10 years of building the party for us to be able to get close enough to the working class to realise that potential for workers moving forward spontaneously. In 1905, Lenin was to open the doors of the party. It wasn't a closed, tight organisation. But not at all. In 1905, when the class was moving forward, Lenin was not only opening the doors of the party, Bolsheviks worked in practice, close to people they'd split from 2 years before, close to some of the Mensheviks, close to people like Trotsky, arguments, debates, at the same time as maintaining the idea you have to have a party, you don't blur the differences. I'll come back to that. You talk later about the history of the party. The history of the party is a history of discussions and debates at every decisive moment. And it's not a question, Lenin puts the line, someone disagrees, that's the end of the discussion. You talk about the party, for instance, in 1912, from 1910 to 1914, a very important period, a revival of struggle in Russia. You find the idea arises of, let's have a daily paper, Pravda. Initially, Lenin is a bit hesitant about this idea. Then he sees the things cutting. Then he becomes the most enthusiastic person pushing Pravda forward. It's not true all the ideas come from his head, he imposes them on people. Something else. Far from being hermetically sealed, Pravda produced jointly by Bolsheviks and another small group of revolutionaries who didn't fully accept Lenin's ideas. Again, you find that even after 1903, it's not true there's one split division between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, and that's the end of it. The whole period between 1903 and 1917 is a question of debate, argument. Some people move to the Bolsheviks, some people move from the Bolsheviks to the Mensheviks, some people move from the Mensheviks back to the Bolsheviks. The whole period is not a tight-knit division. So much so, that if you read about 1917, you find far from this idea of this tight, monolithic, closed-off party. There are continual debates taking place in the Bolshevik party, and around its fringe there are other groups who people think are being similar to the Bolshevik party. I mean, I was amazed when I recently read for the first time, bad admission I suppose, Harman's History of the Russian Revolution, and he refers to the intercity group, a group which Trotsky's a member of, a non-Bolshevik group. He refers to them as Bolsheviks. I read a history of the Baku Commune, 1918-1919, and you read all the Mensheviks talk about the Novaya Zhizna Bolsheviks. Novaya Zhizna was an anti-Bolshevik paper produced by Gorky, but what it really meant is the Bolsheviks are seen as the left of the movement, at the centre of that was Lenin, who had managed to organise a party in that, and other groupings around. It wasn't a sealed off, hermetically sealed organisation. Above all, the history is a history of arguments and debates. Just look at the Bolshevik Party in 1940 to 1918. A huge debate breaks out about the most fundamental principles. First, the debate over revolutionary defeatism in 1914. Lenin produces a statement saying we are for the defeat of our own fatherland in this war. To defeat its main enemies at home. If the Russian ruling class is defeated, we should welcome it. Kamenev, leader of the Bolshevik group in the Tsarist Duma, stands up and says, we're against the war, but we don't at all accept Lenin's position. Says so in public. Does Lenin say that's the end of Kamenev, liquidating, driving out, and so forth? No, because Lenin is leading a party which there are workers, intellectuals, a history of struggle. You go through the debates take place. In 1917, it's still taken for granted that Kamenev is a Bolshevik leader. Bukharin, one of the younger intellectual leaders of the party, comes out along with a few people like Yakovlev in the middle of the First World War with an analysis that any struggle for national liberation will play into the hands of one imperialism or another. Therefore, Bolsheviks should be opposed to the right of nations to self-determination. Absolutely central in a country like the Russian Empire, where half the population are non-Russian speaking. Does it mean that Lenin just liquidates Bukharin from the party? No, because a debate takes place. Because the party is a party of workers fused in struggle, intellectuals, debates take place, arguments have to take place, discussion is taken for granted in the Bolshevik party in this period. In 1917, Lenin comes in April, declares, down with the provisional government, all power to the Soviets. What's the reaction? These automatons, apparently, these professional revolutionaries allegedly made at the Bolshevik party, hypnotised by Lenin into doing everything he says. They print this statement in Pravda, the daily paper, which says, this is a personal statement by Comrade Lenin, who's been able to touch the situation. None of the rest of us understand really that it is wrong. A long debate takes place within the ranks of the party in order to clarify the line, before the line is clarified. In the July days of the garrison in Leningrad, and the workers in Leningrad, furious and bitter at the betrayals of the provisional government make a push to seize power. The Bolshevik Party, the Bolshevik leadership, I say leadership, Lenin, Harman, Zinoviev, Trotsky, and so forth, decide that if they seize power, they will be smashed. They have to hold the masses back. Does this mean the whole party behaves like a monolith in order to react in this situation? Actually, no, because if you read them, you find the Bolshevik military paper for the army argues for the seizure of power. The other Bolshevik paper, produced more directly under the influence of Lenin, Trotsky, and so forth, argue against the seizure of power. The reason is because the Bolshevik Party represents a mass workers' organisation by this time. Something like 10% of the Russian working class in the Bolshevik Party by the July days. Debates have to take place, arguments, discussions, different experiences coming into the past, and the discussion takes place. Or again, after the seizure of power, in January, February, March 1918, the central argument takes place. Should the Bolsheviks make peace with Germany, even if Germany demands the seizure of the third of the territory of the old Russian Empire at the Peace of Brest-Litovsk? Bitter quarrels break through. People will probably know that for a period Lenin was a minority in the party. It's only at the end of protracted arguments he becomes the majority. How do these arguments take place? Here's a very, very good account of the atmosphere in a book which Victor Serge, who was an anarchist who came to Bolshevism, Victor Serge wrote, called The Year One of the Revolution. And he describes it. What kind of picture do we see of the party in this crisis? This party, so disciplined and so little encumbered by an abstract fetishism of democracy, still in these grave hours respects its norms of internal democracy. It puts its recognised leader in a minority. Lenin's tremendous authority does not hinder the militants of the Central Committee from standing up to him and energetically maintaining their point of view. The most important questions are settled by a vote, often by small majorities, to which minorities are willing to defer without banning their ideas. Lenin, winning the minority, submits while waiting for events to prove him right, and continues his propaganda without breaking discipline. That's not a picture of model you get from the various liberal and Menshevik historians, or the picture you get from the anarchists, how the Bolshevik Party, they claim, operates. And it's certainly not a picture you've had at any period in the history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union since Stalin took over until its disintegration of the party at the present. It's something which characterised Bolshevism, didn't characterise Stalinism, and I'll also argue later, didn't characterise Menshevism or anarchism either. This idea of the internal democratic debate. You take a final great crisis of the party, the crisis of 1921. And I don't want to go into the whole background, because I'm sure this has been done at some other meeting in this course. But the country is starving. Famine sweeps the country. Cholera sweeps the country. In parts of the country, cannibalism is taking place. The cities are denuded of workers. The Red Army has won the war, the Civil War, but in the process, the working class has shrunk to an insignificant force in the country. The ex-militants from the working class try and hang on to power. In that situation, tempestuous debate breaks out about how to run the country. The so-called trade union question debate. With Lenin has a position, Bukharin has a diametrically opposite position, and Trotsky has some middle position. An argument takes place. And on the fringes, I shouldn't say on the fringes, a small group of the party, perhaps 10% of the party, puts forward a program called the Program of the Workers' Opposition. What's the response? Does Lenin just drive out, use the Cheka, a very powerful force at that point, after years of civil war? Does he use the Cheka to destroy his opponents? Or does Trotsky use the Red Army to destroy his opponents? Far from it. You can read the debates at the Congress, the 9th and 10th Party Congress, over these questions, over debates. People are listening to speakers speaking but in one position for an hour, a 2-hour discussion. Somebody else stands up with a rival position, an hour, a 2-hour discussion. In 1921, the program of the left opposition, the program of the workers' opposition, printed in 250,000 copies. Special supplements in Pravda, the daily paper, devoted to discussion taking place. This is not a party of dictated from above, run as a sort of personal apparatus of Lenin. It's something rather different. So what really then are we talking about when we talk about democratic centralism? I'll try and confront the arguments I see it. It's this. You see, the first thing you have to say, when you talk about any party, the idea that there's an inbuilt contradiction between democracy and centralism is rubbish. It's absolute rubbish. If you can have centralism without democracy, but you cannot have democracy without centralism. I'll tell you what I mean. Centralism without democracy. If I stand here with a submachine gun and tell you all to run from the room, that's centralism. I'm in charge and you obey. No doubt. If I have a whip and tell you to start, I don't know, hauling boulders up to create a pyramid, that's centralism. There's no democracy. On the other hand, if we have a vote, if we vote here for something, you vote that I should get off the stage and be replaced by someone more articulate, like Seth. And you have the vote, and I refuse to get off the stage. That's not democracy. If the vote doesn't lead to a centralised decision being taken and acted upon, it's not democracy. You cannot have democracy without centralism. If you have a party which produces a newspaper once a week, you can have a party which produces a newspaper once a week, which the editor just does what he wants. Maybe you think that's what we do anyway. That's not democracy. For it to become democratic, it has to be the votes, decisions, have to result in centralised implementation of decisions. You cannot talk about democracy without centralism. You talk about centralism without democracy. You have under Stalinism, I think you have it in Kinnock's Labour Party, you have it under a bourgeois state. You can't talk about democracy without centralism. And therefore the whole idea that because the Bolshevik Party was a centralised party, it was therefore a non-democratic party, is absolute and complete rubbish. It rests upon a logical contradiction. But what then is the argument about? I think if you want to see the argument about, if you look historically, it's worth contrasting the behaviour of the Bolshevik Party and the behaviour of their historical opponents, the Mensheviks. Of course, the real debate, really, argument in 1903, when the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks split, it was not at all clear to people what the division was about. It was about some word, I can never even remember the wording in the party programme. They split over this, that shows my lack of memory or my senility, or my lack of understanding of Marxism or something. But they split over one wording. Effectively it amounted to, should people be be members of an organisation of the party, or should they support the policies of the party? That effectively was the division. But many people couldn't understand the division. In fact, we thought Lenin became a lunatic when he imposed this division. In practice, if you look at the history of the two parties, it became clear. At every decisive juncture, every great crisis in Russian history between 1903 and 1918, or later if you want, the Bolshevik Party, there were huge internal debates. At the end of those internal debates, the party behaved, came to a decision, and acted as one to try and implement those decisions. And you can see, in 1905, the Bolsheviks decide we have to have an uprising in Moscow. The culmination of the story has been an armed uprising. The Bolshevik Party in Moscow stages the uprising. How did the Menshevik Party behave in 1905? Some of them think we need an uprising, some of them against an uprising. Some of them think we have to beg the liberals to take power, some of them come to the view that the workers to take power. The Mensheviks do not behave as a coherent organisation. But actually, what's it mean when you say they don't behave like a coherent organisation? What it means is they're best known members, and that tends to be their members most deeply influential in the old society. Those who the bourgeois media will promote and encourage and give prominence to come to the fore and dictate the overall policy of the party. So, despite the divergence of opinion within the Menshevik Party in 1905, you will see, look at the historic record, the Bolsheviks were on the left, they staged the uprising, the Mensheviks were on the right, even though many individual Mensheviks supported the uprising. Or again, take the situation in 1917, and there's people should read Sir Carnot's book. It's recently been out in the Bookmarks Club, and it's a very, very interesting book to read. It's written by an extreme left-wing Menshevik through 1917. And what he says over and over again, he says, I don't like what the Mensheviks are doing in the government. They're behaving disgustingly. We must do something about them. What am I going to do? I'm going to go to a Menschik meeting. That Menschik meeting won't make any decisions. They'll stay in the government. What he doesn't admit to, he's allowed himself to be dictated to by the lack of organisation in the Menschik party. You contrast the Bolsheviks, they have a huge row over the original government, they come to a decision, they act according to the decision. They have a huge row over the July days, they come to a decision, they act according to the decision. They have a huge row on the eve of the October Revolution, they come to a decision, they act on the decision. They translate democratic discussion into activity. Centralism makes them a democratic party. Lack of centralism makes the Mensheviks an undemocratic party. But of course, in reality, and I'll say about the Mensheviks, it's true about anarchist organisations, lack of democratic centralism never means lack of centralism in reality. Every political party or political current has a press. If you don't have democratic control of the press, if you don't have democratic centralism, it means the particular prominent person who has the money or the influence to control the newspaper, or is there by some act of God, some freak of nature, determines the policy. You say, who determined the policy of the Mensheviks in 1970? At the end of the 19th century, it was centralised. Dan and Martinov and these people, they were there, they were playing around with the original government, they had roles in it, they determined what happened. Martov didn't like what they were doing, couldn't stop it. Didn't matter if he could get majority of Menschik support for his position. He couldn't impose his line. The centralism was undemocratic centralism. Which is exactly, of course, what we have in this country, the Labour Party today. The Labour Party has a sort of daily Labour newspaper, the Daily Mirror. Because it's not Labour Party is not a democratic centralist organisation, they don't control Robert Maxwell. Robert Maxwell controls them. Robert Maxwell decides to throw lie after lie at Arthur Scargill. Robert Maxwell decides to scab on strikes and so on and so forth. He maintains his Labour Party card. Neil Kinnock paints one Robert Maxwell's. He lives in fear of Robert Maxwell not supporting Labour at the next election. In reality, Maxwell determined the line of the Labour Party. Lack of democratic centralism leads to lack of democracy. The same is true in every anarchist organisation. If an organisation doesn't have a democratic centralist structure, at the end of the day, he who controls the printing press, or in the case of most anarchist organisations, duplicator, controls the line that comes out. That's why, actually, anarchist organisations split so much. Because they end up in personal wrangles. They bore the idea of having a vote and coming to a decision, and minorities doing what the majorities want, so the minority determines what the majority support. Again, if you read the history of the Russian Revolution, I haven't got great time to talk about this here with another meeting, look at the role of the anarchists. Many individual anarchists, many anarchists individually came to support the most radical demands in the revolution. But other anarchists said, we can't overthrow the provisional government, that's the authoritarian. And then the Bolsheviks come to power, everyone is starving, the Bolsheviks have confiscated the wealth of the very rich, and so on and so forth. There isn't genuine egalitarianism and so forth, and the anarchists say, why should I give up my big loaf of bread, such someone else should have a crust of bread? I'm an anarchist, no authoritarianism. And what do other anarchists say? Oh, we can't oppress them, we can't suppress them, etc. Except for the best anarchists, people like Bill Chartov. The best anarchists in that situation become Bolsheviks. Victor Serge becomes a Bolshevik, because in practice, you can't fiddle around in that situation. Or again, I think I'm getting late about the anarchists, but if you look at the anarchists in the Spanish Civil War, what's it amount to? The anarchists are asked to have some ministers. They don't have a democratic socialist organisation. Anarchists become ministers. The rest of the anarchist movement can't discipline them, can't control them, and so forth. What the anarchists do is determined by the ministers, just as in a social democratic party. What you do is determined by the ministers, not determined by collective activity. Now, let me move on a bit about what Bolshevism, the Bolshevik theory of democratic socialism was about. Or I'd like to say the Socialist Workers' Party theory of democratic centralism, but I don't see any difference as far as I'm concerned. It's this. If you're going to be effective as a political organisation, you have to have centralism. If you're going to print a newspaper which appears on a weekly or a daily basis that has to say something. And it has to say something in relationship to what's happening. And what it says determines what the members have to be responsible for. If we say Arthur Scott hasn't got his fingers in the till, which we do say adamantly, then the fact is every member, everyone who sells socialist worker, is identified with that. You don't go and say, by socialist worker, of course, after the last guy's got his fingers in the till, we just tell these things, it's Chris Harman happy. The lie is determined, but more seriously perhaps, as you're faced with a sudden unofficial strike, say in the docks, in one port. The question of, you have to say, can we spread it? If we can spread it, we have to try and get every other dock out tomorrow. We can't wait indefinitely, just one port on strike. In that situation, the party as a whole has to campaign for something. You have to campaign for your tax. You have to respond very quickly. Of necessity, you have centralised response. If you have centralised response, then you have to have a centralised organ, centralised organisation. Someone has to get on the phone and say to our doctors, unfortunately, it's a bit dated because they all got sacked last year, but I had to say to our doctors, get your finger out, look, Liverpool are out on strike, are you going to do anything? Now if they turn around and say, I'm sorry, we do our best, we can't get on strike, we don't worry. If they turn around and say, fuck off, I'm an anarchist, I don't care if you actually, I'll tell you what you actually have to say. In that situation, they're breaking every normal democracy, you expel them from the organisation. There's something else, and if you look at the history of the Bolshevik Party, it's this. It's not the idea of this central leader who gives the orders, everyone else jumps to obey. Fight the class struggle. You have to develop a division of labour between people who collect information at the centre, people who are aware that they can move to the classes, who try to assess what's being done, and the people on the ground who necessarily can't have on an hour-by-hour, day-by-day basis information about the whole mood of the class. You have to try and centralise, a sort of cybernetic analogy, you have to centralise the information in order to come to a decision and then pass down the feedback to the roots. You can't do that if you just have centralism. You know, the idea that we could shut Tony Cliff, in an ivory tower somewhere, or a water tower perhaps near up Allerton Road, shove him in there, and that he will just dictate on a computer what we have to do. It's nonsense. But the idea that you can just leave the individual members around the country, each of them automatically come to the conclusion, oh, Daily Mirror's lying about Arthur Scott, no problem, we don't need any significant central information, a strike's taking place, we don't need to worry, we will do whatever we feel, whatever we want. That's nonsense. You have to talk about a mechanism from the roots to the centre and back to the roots. You can't have that without centralism. You can't have it without democracy in the sense of the members continually evaluating themselves, looking what the centre's done, have we got the right people at the centre making the decisions, do we have the right structures, are we responding quick enough, and so forth. And in that process, the thing is not mechanical, it's not a mechanical top-down relationship, it's an organic relationship. It grows over time. You discover elementary things. You discover there's some people who are capable of doing certain functions and some people who can't. In any branch, you find people who are not capable, however hard they try, of turning up to meetings on time. Well, two things important. On the morning of the insurrection, anyone who tells those people to bring the machine guns along should be shot. And I won't mention any names of the other people who work at the print shop. But you learn, in a similar way, you learn that people systematically, sometimes, make similar errors. As people always get carried away when the movement goes up the up. And you know in advance that they won't judge the real objective situation. They'll be a good thing, they'll be so involved, so enthusiastic, they won't look at the negative features. You end up joking about them, don't you? It's the upturn, isn't it, Mike? You say that. You joke about them. At the same time, you're also aware they have enormously important for the organisation. At the same time, you understand you don't put them by themselves in key decision-making positions. And again, you have to learn from experience. You see, there have been situations in history, revolutionary history, where it's people with those sorts of emotional non-objective analysis, how many people, if you talk about what went wrong with the German Revolution in January 1919, it is Liebknecht, who was exactly one of these highly emotional, absolutely courageous, 100% revolutionary, didn't have the discipline of going and talking to his comrades. Really, am I getting carried away by the movement again? Tell me that I'm going too far. Let's discuss it through. Identified by the decision. So Liebknecht and Wilhelm Piest put their name to a leaflet announcing the overthrow of
Sorry,
these.
comrades, but there's a wheel camp about to climb someone's car outside Elo right now, so whoever's car it is, can they quickly get in?
Lots of people sitting there in anxiety, wanting to turn. The point is, in that height of the moment, they get carried away. They call for the overthrow of the original government, of the Social Democratic government. They provide the excuse to the Social Democratic government to clamp down on the revolutionary minority before the minority of workers have come over. In that situation, you can say the lack of democratic centralism leads to complete tragedy, unnecessary defeat. That's a high point. It happens again and again. We know the number of cases of comrades in workplaces. We've been in a workplace for years. Nothing's happened. Suddenly someone walks out on strike. We must throw ourselves in. What do? You act individually. You either veer too much to the left or you veer too much to the right. You have to talk about collective action. Democratic centralism, at the most basic level, is about individuals subordinating themselves not to the party of some abstraction, but their fellow party comrades. In the workplace, you talk about other people in the workplace and in your local branch. What should we do? How do we respond? How do we scientifically evaluate? How do we turn experience into scientific knowledge, on the basis of scientific knowledge, acting in such a way to carry the movement forward, not to lead to unnecessary defeats? If you talk about in the locality, you then have to have a party which creates structures which are capable of drawing this experience together. People say we don't want these structures. They infringe upon our individual freedom. They're actually saying we don't want democracy, we don't want debate, we don't want scientific assessment of the situation, which is effectively where the anarchist Menschlich position leads you to. There's no difference in reality between the anarchist and the Menschlich position when it comes to this. Now the last thing I really want to say is, if you look at the reality of the Bolshevik practice, it was this sort of organic discipline. You see, and let me specify, when I say organic discipline, it means that most of the discipline of the Revolutionary Party doesn't consist of giving orders. I remember I talked to an ex-Maoist in Canada 4 or 5 years ago in Vancouver, and he said, in a revolutionary party, the party leadership tells the people in the factories what to do. And I thought, what a load of bollocks. It really is. That when the idea when Grant MacDonald was in a factory in Manchester, I'm on the Central Committee, I should pick up the phone and say, you've got to stop Kellogg's today. It's nonsense. What in reality happens is you phone up and you say, look, there's a miners' strike on Brian. Actually, I didn't do it, but I'm sure someone did it. We're trying to get delegations through. What can you do in your factory? And he says, oh, we can't do much. People are very backward. They don't understand the strike. And we say, you sure? And you argue, and you argue, and you argue. At the end of 5 or 6 hours of argument, usually, one or other option gives way. Usually. I mean, and to be honest, it's not a question of mechanical discipline. It's a question of organic. You learn to argue, debate, and create an atmosphere. Nevertheless, there are moments which you need mechanical discipline. Anyone who was on one of the National Front demonstrations in the late 1970s will understand to do it properly. I remember the Lewisham demonstration. I wasn't a steward on it. I was working for the paper. I was a rank and member, obeying what the steward said. If the steward said, throw stones at those Nazi bastards, you threw a stone. If the steward said, we charge forward, you charge forward. You do have points of mechanical discipline. If the steward say, run away, you run like fuck. And when you have and here again, there's a difference clear between the attitude and the anarchist attitude. The anarchists say it doesn't matter what you do. The Mensheviks really have this condescending attitude. You know, the leaders will do one thing, the rank and file will do what they want. Our attitude in these situations is most of the time organic discipline. At certain high points of the struggle, it turns up to mechanical discipline. If you're told you don't cross a picket line because it's scabby, you don't cross a picket line. You may go and disagree with your party branch 2 days later, but actually there are elements where you come to questions of mechanical discipline. And then again, if you look at the Bolshevik experience, it's very important. People the idea that this Bolsheviks were an elite of privileged people. What mechanical discipline, organic discipline meant, the debates, the arguments, what should we do, shall we seize power, do we make peace with Germany and so forth. There are elements of mechanical discipline. When Trotsky ran the Red Army, quite rightly he said, if an ordinary worker or peasant runs away from the whites, that's disgrace terrible, we have to deal with it politically. If a Bolshevik disobeys orders and runs away, we shoot him. Why? Because the Bolsheviks are those people who are meant to understand what's happening, to be organised and so forth. You disgrace the party, you disgrace everything you stand for if you run away, if you're a coward in the face of an enemy offensive. To be honest, let's be clear, if you talk about how Lenin ran the Bolsheviks, the number of people who were shot was minimal, and always the cowardice in the face of the past enemy, not for internal disagreements. The amount of organic discipline was enormous. Now, and I'll finish, for any anarchists here, I'll finish by another quote from Victor Searle, which really, for me, summed up what it was all about. And he says, he describes the Bolshevik Party in 1918. He says, at this hour, the party really is the courageous armed cohort. It's a living organism, teeming with the initiative of the lowest and the highest ranks, disciplined into its most senior leader, regarding with love and respect the methods it has forged through long years of struggle, but knowing how to contradict them and put them in a minority. It's equipped with a collective leadership and with healthy political traditions, which make it able to avoid excesses of authority as well as democracy. The centre leads and has to be followed, but this centre is itself the expression of the party, and so the party of the masses. That, comrades, is the sort of party we have to try and build. It's not a Stalinist party, it's not an authoritarian cult led by one leader at the top, everyone else obeying, but it's a party which knows how individuals consult the party members of the locality before taking actions which have important effects, which learn to build structures which can centralise our struggle and doesn't fall to the anarchist and Menshevik nonsense that these structures are dangerous.
If they could indicate. Sure, it can't be all these comrades, you know.
Feminine characteristics, on the other, extreme male characteristics, with no sharp division in the middle. Put it in other terms, a woman could be assertive and commanding.
Democratic centrism is discredited everywhere. I want to know by whom and among whom. If you're to believe the press, socialism is discredited everywhere. Socialism exists in the Eastern Bloc, and even with some of the East European comrades here this week, I mean, we've been having discussions, we say it's not socialist. It's not really existing socialism. It's not socialist state capitalism. And we have to say what exists, what Ligachev stands for, what Brezhnev stood for, what Khrushchev stood for, what Stalin stood for, in no sense was democratic centralism. And it's not difficult to convey the argument. What the first two opposition groups inside the Bolshevik Party, in opposition to bureaucratisation? The workers' opposition was one, and what was the other one called? The democratic centralists. Old Bolsheviks, people like Sopronov, who looked back to what the Bolshevik Party had been, when it was an organic part of the workers' movement. I'm not saying they were right in all their conclusions. I mean, that leads a whole different discussion about how you behave in a situation in which civil war, famine, cholera, disease has virtually destroyed the working class as an active force. But they look back to Lenin's party as it had existed between 1903 and 1918 as their model. And for us to say that the bourgeoisie, the journalists of all sorts, draw easy answers, and to say that the students in Romania attack statues of Lenin. I'm sure if I lived in Romania, my instinct would be to attack statues of Lenin. I went on the Leningrad Underground, and the Leningrad Underground is called the Lenin Metropolitan Railway System of the heroic Lenin city of Leningrad. If you're brought up with that, you hate the man. But are you right to hate the man, or are actually, in reality, had the ruling class stolen him from you? So actually, to get back to the reality, you have to steal him back. I mean, when in Russia people raise the thing, deal with Lenin's mausoleum, I say yes, because I know why the guards are outside Lenin's mausoleum. They can keep him buried in there. They keep his ideas from circulating, from people discussing. The cult of Lenin rose upon the death of Leninism. That's the truth. Raised up by Zinoviev, established into an edifice by Stalin, maintained by Khrushchev and Brezhnev. The sooner the cult of Lenin ends, the more rapidly people begin to think, Christ, in a great tradition of revolutionary figures in Russian history, Lenin stands with Trotsky at the pinnacle of it. If you want to be a revolutionary, you have to study him. Not as a cult, as someone who made mistakes, who was wrong, who blundered, and so on and so forth, but nevertheless someone from whom we can learn. The same way we can learn from Marx, and the same way we can learn from great bourgeois revolutionaries, like Marat, or Robespierre, or Cromwell. We can learn from all of them if we see in the historic context, provided we don't start with a cult of them. Now, and you see, you go on the other mistakes that you made. You see, one of the anarchists said the Civil War, April 1918, before the Civil War started. You want to read a history of the period. A history of the period. 1918. I just read a history, I said it before, the Baku Commune. Baku in 1918. The Civil War was raging all around the south of Russia at that time. The Cossacks had risen up. The Georgian Mensheviks were working with the Cossacks against the revolution. The Turkish army was marching into Armenia against Armenia and Azerbaijan. The Baku Commune was threatened by civil war, died in blood 2 months later. Moscow was hungry. The bread ration in Moscow was it? I can't remember. Never knew it was an eighth of a pound of bread a day or a quarter of a pound of bread a day in that situation. And in that situation, you have a group of anarchists armed to the teeth who refuse to accept the rationing because of an intrusion on individual freedom. I'll tell you what my line on that is. I'm a moderate. We offer them what the Bolsheviks did. We offer them, we negotiate with them, we argue with them. At the end of the day, if they don't abide by the discipline, you have no choice but to take military measures against them. If there's people starving and there's anarchists who won't deliver food to them, you have to take the hard line on it. And of course the Bolshevik method worked because a good half of the Russian anarchists ended up with the Bolsheviks. To say that the anarchists today don't like, the best anarchists, read Victor Serge, the best anarchists ended up with the Bolsheviks. They had all sorts of moral qualms like Victor Serge did. They didn't like what they had to do. They didn't like the authoritarian measures, but they saw they had to take them. Now, you see, the question then, other thing which arose, see, the Trotskyist movement is a result of bureaucratic degeneration. I'll tell you what's wrong with the Trotskyist movement. It's nothing to do with bureaucratic degeneration. People are interested in bureaucratic posts. They don't join. They don't join the Bolshevik, the little Trotskyist groups that degenerated most. If you're interested in a great life in the labour movement, you don't join the American Socialist Workers' Party. It degenerated terribly. You wouldn't have joined Healy's Socialist Labour League, later the WRP, if what you're interested in is getting ahead in bourgeois society. They degenerated because they didn't have a clear political analysis based upon discussion and scientific evaluation. They couldn't come to terms with the political reality of the world in which they worked.
Some people who were considered to be on the left, maybe feeling like in the Communist Party, who themselves, having been the best upholders of the Stalin tradition for years, and the people who have most contributed to confusing the question of Stalinism with Lenin, really their collapse and their indictment of both the October Revolution itself and the Bolshevik tradition really bring home just how, just what the depth of the reaction is, if you like, and really what we do come up to defend. start with Eric Possible, who does history, either in college or at school, when he gets to read some of his stuff. This is what he actually was saying in January, in the Independent on Sunday, in an interview. This is what he said about October. Retrospective cost-benefit exercises are pretty pointless. What happened, happened. It's perfectly clear, looking back, that if one knew one played the option of making the October Revolution and then constructing socialism in one country, namely Russia, one wouldn't have done it. Looking back, it would have been better if they had picked another way. But what's the use of going back? They went this way. Now, what abject fatalism on the one hand, Stalinism mixed up in it the other hand, because it talks about the inevitability of socialism in one country, but the inevitable conclusion that the October Revolution shouldn't happen. So what's his conclusions really? That socialists, I won't say revolutionaries anymore, should do. If there's any future for the left in this country, it is in and through the Labour Party. That's where the action is. I'll take Chris Myers, who's the International Secretary of the Communist Party, who wrote in the Morning Star in February, Russia's October 1917 revolution was a mistake of historic proportions. The time has come when it is possible for communists to face a very difficult truth. Right? Really, what took the biscuit in terms of the absolute nonsense which was talked about the October Revolution and the Marxist tradition, really came with this interview in the Financial Times by Martin Jakes, who pretended to be conversing with Karl Marx himself. It's actually disgusting, because he actually puts into Marxism now exactly thoughts of Marxism today. And even offers him some repression about their right and liberty, which is their Marx sacrifice. He asks Marx, what did you think of 1989? Fascinating, a remarkable year. In some years it is like 1848, an irresistible popular movement in so many countries all at the same time. But this time the revolution will probably survive. There are revolutions for democracy. I think 1989 is the end of 1917. It is the end of the era of the Russian Revolution. I'm afraid it has failed. Now that's not disgusting enough. Again, the conclusion that not only do you abandon October, but you abandon the tradition of Bolshevism, comes up with the next question. This is Martin Jakes to quote Karl Marx. Looking back on it now, would you be sympathetic to one of your followers, the revisionist Edward Bernstein, who became a powerful advocate of gradualism, of seeing the process of reform as rather more important than the ultimate goal of the revolution? Marx seemed unsure how to respond. He passed his hand through his beard, then said, in retrospect, I think I was right until the failure of the revolutions in Western Europe in the early 1920s. That marked the end of the possibility of revolution in the advanced capitalist countries. The best option then was the path of reform, the parties of the Second International, by the German Social Democrats, probably offered the best long-term model. So you see very, very clearly that the Communist Party leaders, theoreticians call themselves what they may, actually themselves couple the question of the October insurrection and the question of the Bolshevik party. And of course, I think another of the quotes which took the biscuit, they're completely what they were doing this, was Bernard Barrelson, long-time industrial organiser, who was in fact responsible for some of the worst Stalinist practices inside the Communist Party, when he wrote that really not only had they made many mistakes, but really democratic centralism, the organisation of the Bolshevik Party was to blame. Now, essentially, there are some common distortions, really, about Leninism, which really reflect the Stalinist tradition, not the Leninist tradition, but which really have been absorbed by the left and really have been confirmed on a massive scale, supposedly by the parts of Eastern Europe. Only confirmed by the Eastern European countries had any remote connection with the Social Union, of course, we never did. But one of a number of these conceptions, one of them that in fact the party acts on behalf of the working class, that the party substitutes for the working class, so that in fact when the Bolsheviks led the siege of power in October 1917, it didn't result in the dictatorship of the proletariat, the working class seizing power inside Russia. It was actually a party seizing power independently of the working class. The second myth, which is always promoted, that in fact not only is the party in that sense independent of the working class, but it's a complete and unalterable monolith. That there is one man at the top of the party who dictates to the rest of the party what the party will think and what the party will do. And of course all the party members are really like lemmings. They simply automatically, they don't think, they can't think, that's particularly why they join the party, because they can't think, and they all automatically do whatever the leadership says. And thirdly, that in the case at least of Lenin, until recently, Lenin was the leader of the Bolshevik party, the man who never ever made any mistakes whatsoever. Now those myths, as I say, are a reflection of the Stalinist counter-revolution, as somebody pointed out in the meeting which was Harman did. The Stalinist counter-revolution actually required a complete liquidation of the Bolshevik tradition, which meant the liquidation of the Bolshevik Central Committee, of the key cadre inside the Bolshevik party, the complete smashing physically of the Bolshevik tradition in order to resurrect on its grave the Stalinist model which people today are always confused with Leninism. Now it's those myths really which I want to deal with in terms of talking about the revolution process between February and October. Because essentially what we see occurring between February and October, February being the crux of the old Tsarist regime, the beautiful revolution, everybody turns out, martyrs, the Tsarist autocracy has fallen, but in reality, what occurs as a result of the February revolution is in fact a situation of dual power, a situation where the bourgeoisie in Russia is effectively handing power because the dominating influence is amongst the masses, amongst the workers and the peasants. The social revolutionaries and the Mensheviks themselves had no intention of taking power, actually wanted the bourgeoisie in Russia to take power. So actually the provisional government being formed representing the interests of the bourgeoisie in Russia, that institution on the one hand combined with the institution of the Soviet, the workers and soldiers councils, and then following that the peasant councils which is set up on the land. The situation which the provisional government could not move without the say-so of the Soviets, and equally the Soviets until the Bolsheviks became the majority in the Soviets. The Soviets themselves were not prepared to move without the say-so of the provisional government, nearly always referring to the provisional government and so on and so forth. And in the period between, in that situation, which occurred after the February Revolution in February, what really took place between February and October was the different class interests which existed inside Russia constantly sharpened, because the aspirations of the different classes in Russia were of course necessarily different. The bourgeoisie wanted to continue the exploitation of the working class inside Russia, wanted to continue to prosecute the imperialist war along with the Allies in the First World War. On the other hand, the workers actually wanted the 8-hour day, wanted control over the factories, wanted deal with the problems of hunger in the cities. The peasants actually wanted the land which they from the landlords, and of course the soldiers continually still bitterly embroiled in the trenches of the First World War, above all wanted peace. And the oppressed nationalities inside Russia, who Trotsky described as whose democratic aspirations actually first really in many cases awakened by the upsurge of February, themselves wanting to throw off that oppression, to establish their right to speak their own languages, to control their own civil services, to control their own way of life. The dynamic of those separate struggles actually increasingly sharpened, coming into conflict with the interests of the bourgeoisie. That continuous struggle is really the key to understanding the shift inside Russia from the dominance initially inside the Soviets of social revolutionarism and mentioning to the Bolsheviks winning a majority. And once the Bolsheviks actually became a majority inside Petrograd, inside Moscow, and the other major industrial centres, actually that becoming the point where it was possible for the Bolsheviks to talk in terms of the October insurrection. And throughout that period, throughout the period between February and October, what we constantly see is the sharpening of those conflicts on the one hand, the testing by the masses themselves of the ability of provisional government to deliver what they wanted, and of the nature of the Soviets in relation to what they wanted. And therefore the shift, as I say, politically from to the left, combined with the attempt at the same time, at certain points by the bourgeoisie, to wrest back control from the Soviets, from the masses, from the working class, and from the peasantry. And really, the story of how the Bolshevik Party operated was in relation to that dynamic, both the surge forward of the working class and the soldiers and the peasants. Also, the edge when the bourgeoisie attempted to retake power, and the unevenness which existed inside that class dynamic. Because necessarily, a mass party like the Bolshevik Party, which was approximately 25,000 strong in February, and actually grew to 250,000 by October, precisely because it was part of the working class, had influence, some influence amongst the peasantry, and quite a lot of influence amongst the soldiers, necessarily reflected the shifts and changes taking place amongst those layers, and therefore reflecting inside its ranks all those pressures, all the debates about what was changing inside the country, and that in turn giving rise to the debates and the polemics which took place inside the Bolshevik Party, which were extremely sharp indeed, and which were absolutely essential for the Bolshevik Party to be able to really lead in terms of being a real organized party. In fact, the way Trotsky actually describes the situation in the history of the Russian Revolution, talking about the relationship between the masses on the one hand and the political parties on the other, puts it like this: the masses go into a revolution not with a prepared plan of social reconstruction, but with a sharp feeling that they cannot endure the old regime. Now, only the guiding layers of the class have a political programme, and even this still requires a test of events and the approval of the masses. The fundamental political process of the revolution must consist in a gradual comprehension by a class of the problems arising from the social crisis, the active orientation of the masses by a method of successive approximations, the different stages of the revolutionary process, certified by a chain of parties in which the more extreme always supersedes the left, express the growing pressure to the left of the masses, so long as the swing of the movement does not run into objective obstacles. When it does, there begins a reaction, disappointments of the different layers of the revolutionary class, growth of indifferences, and therewith a strengthening of the position of the counter-revolutionary forces. at least the general outline of the old revolution. He then actually goes on to talk about the relationship. In other words, I mean, what he's saying is very, very important. When the masses made the revolution in February, they do it out of the instinct that they can't stand the old way of living, but are themselves not yet clear what they in reality want, and therefore have to test out the political parties which represent the different party interests to prove in practice whether in actual fact what direction those political parties are going in, and whether they actually measure up to their own measure up in their own class interests. And it's in the context of that clarification process, in the context of that struggle, that the revolutionary party, that the Bolshevik party, was actually able to become the majority, because the masses themselves were able to clearly identify that the Bolsheviks really represented their interests. But the relationship between the two is important, because at no stage are you talking about a party which acts on behalf of the masses, independently of the masses, but actually a leadership of the masses organically linked to the masses. The way Trotsky puts it about political parties, they constitute not an independent, but nevertheless a very important element of the process. Without a guiding organisation, the energy of the masses would dissipate like steam, not enclosed in a pistol box. But nevertheless, what moves things is the piston. But nevertheless, what moves things is not the piston or the box, but the steam. Very, very important indeed that the class struggle itself is the dynamic which drives the historical process forward. But without the party which actually channels the steam, which actually channels the revolutionary energy of the masses, that energy of the masses can then be dissipated. That's exactly the analogy, the relationship between party and class, which is really what the Bolshevik party was about. Now, he then actually goes on to talk about why it is that there were such sharp polemics and debates inside the Bolshevik party. Writing in Lessons for October, he says, if you look back, on the basis of our experience, even taking only 1 year, from February 1917 through February 1980, and on the basis of the supplementary experience in Finland, Hungary, Italy, Bulgaria and Germany, we can posit as almost an unalterable law that a party crisis is inevitable in the transition from preparatory revolutionary activity to the immediate struggle for power. Generally speaking, crises arise in the party at every serious turn in the party's course, either as a prelude to the turn or as a consequence of it. The explanation for this lies in the fact that every period in development of the party has special features of its own and forms specific habits and methods of work. A tactical turn implies a greater or lesser break in these habits and methods. Now that's actually something which is very, very important to understand, because it explains two things. Firstly, because the dynamic of struggle is always changing, a party has to shift the way it works according to the changes in the level of struggle. If it suddenly advances, a party actually has to know how to advance very, very rapidly. If it suddenly starts going to retreat, a party actually has to know how to retreat, but to retreat as slowly as possible and in as good order as possible. But inevitably, because it means different ways of working, there are rows amongst the party members about whether there's been a correct assessment of the situation, about whether there really is an advance of the order which people are talking about, whether there isn't an advance of such an order, whether there really is a retreat taking place, whether there is no retreat taking place, and therefore arguments about the assessment of the situation and then really what flows from that. But it also means something else. Not only the party as a whole has to shift and turn in that kind of way, giving rise to what then is always described as bending the stick. You know, that when you actually have to change gear, you have to be cleanly and sharp. You can't actually change. It will take the time over the thing. But it not only gives rise to that phenomenon of sharp changes in a party's direction, how some people sometimes characterise the shifts and turns in the Bolshevik party. But the second thing that it gives rise to is the centrality of the question of leadership and democratic centralism inside the party itself. Essentially, what it means is that the leadership of a revolutionary party has to be that body of people who over a period of time have been best programmed to be the people who can assess the shifts and changes which are taking place in the struggle inside the working class movement, and who adjust to that and then fight like hell amongst the party members for the shifts and changes to take place. Because if the leadership weren't able to see the shifts and changes taking place, then it would mean the party was lagging behind the event. Equally, if the party leadership saw the shifts which were needed to take place, but did absolutely nothing about it and said, oh well, we're just a democratic organisation, we'll wait to see when all the party members have come to the same conclusions as we have, it would be a complete abdication of responsibility. Because of course the struggle itself does not wait for a party to make up its mind. Actually, the party actually has to be debating and shifting and turning with the dynamic struggle part, precisely because the struggle does have its own dynamic. Now, that really brings me on to the first thing I want to deal with, about one of the central things that really Lenin was responsible for doing in the course of the Russian Revolution, which was actually to clarify exactly what the revolution should be about. Central political debate on this question, because of course I said at the beginning that the Soviets were dominated by social revolutionaries and Mensheviks who actually believed that the capitalist class, the bourgeoisie, should take power inside Russia, should keep power, because only capitalist development was possible inside Russia at that stage. Now that was a view not held by Lenin. Lenin had always argued that in fact, it was a view certainly not held by Trotsky, that actually argued that the capitalist class was actually too weak to assume power, and actually the working class would actually have to lead the struggle for power and in fact take power. What Lenin had always argued for was for the democratic dictatorship of the workers and the peasantry. How did the Bolshevik leadership react after the February Revolution? Well, and I say the leadership because in fact there was a difference between the leadership inside Russia and Lenin himself, but also a difference between the leadership and the most advanced workers inside Petrograd. Frankly, Kamenev and Stalin, who took over the editing of the party when they came back to Russia after the February Revolution, took the democratic part of the formulation of democratic dictatorship of the workers and peasantry, and basically argued for support for the provisional government which had been set up, which was a bourgeois government. But not only did they argue for really support for the provisional government, that therefore meant logically, which they did, supporting the policies of that government, which meant the continuation of the imperialist war. So really what the leadership were doing was steering through the party paper, the Bolshevik party, in behind, or essentially becoming the left wing, if you like, of the bourgeoisie after the February Revolution. That actual policy continued inside the Bolshevik party. The October Revolution, frankly, could not have happened. What it resulted in as the workers and the peasants and the soldiers realised what that the provisional government did not respect their wishes, it would have led to, probably a split inside the Bolshevik party itself. So one of the first things that Lenin had to do when he actually came back from abroad, when he arrived back inside Russia, was to take on the question, absolutely essentially, that the workers in Russia had got to seize power themselves. That the February Revolution was only the first stage, there had to be a second revolution, it had to be workers seizing power, because all the demands of the workers, the demands of the peasants and so on and so forth could not be fulfilled, and there could be no peace unless the workers seized power. Now that, in fact, led to one almighty row inside the Bolshevik Party. Initially, when Lenin actually arrived at Finland Station to report his ideas, everybody, including people like Harman and Stein, thought that Lenin had lost his marbles. So here's this great leader that everybody talks about in terms of Lenin. Their attitude to him was, well, the trouble was he'd been stuck in Switzerland, he didn't really know what was going on, he didn't understand the situation, and so on and so forth. Completely dismissive and completely disowning what he wrote in the party newspaper. The real points of support which Lenin initially found actually came from the most advanced work within the Bolshevik Party, inside Petrograd itself, who themselves have been critical of the leadership up to then of the editorial board of Pravda. And actually very quickly, precisely because the workers themselves understood that the provisional government was not delivering the goods that the Soviets kowtowing to the provisional government themselves, Lenin was actually able, basing himself on the real interests of the workers, the best workers inside the Bolshevik Party, was actually able to win the debate really quite quickly inside the Bolshevik Party during the month of April. But I'll just read out that was what was being printed in Pravda at the time. And this is a party, remember, which had actually adopted the slogan of revolutionary defeatism, of the defeat of their own ruling class, of down with the war and so on and so forth. This is one of the things that Stalin and Communist wrote in Pravda. Our slogan is not the empty cry, down with the war, which means that this organisation of the revolutionary army, and that the army was becoming ever more revolutionary. Our slogan is to bring pressure to bear on the provisional government, so as to compel it to make, without fail, openly and before the hours of world democracy, and attempt to induce all the warring countries to initiate immediate negotiations to end the world war. Till then, let everyone remain to his post. Now, Lenin's answer to this was, it is absolutely impermissible to conceal from ourselves and from the people that this government wants to continue the imperial fraud that is laid in the British capital, that it wants to restore the monarchy and strengthen the rule of the landlords and the capitalists. To urge that government to conclude a democratic peace is like teaching virtue to brothel keepers. It carries on in the same vein, which is not the other side of it. To urge the Dutch and the Yukon government to conclude a speedy, honest, democratic and good neighbourly peace is like the good village priest urging the landlords and the merchants to walk in the way of God, to love their neighbours and to turn the other cheek. Now, as you can see, there's an extremely sharp polemic inside the party at the time, in which Lenin gave no quarter, neither did the other side, over the character of the revolution, whether the workers actually had to continue to October or not, and all its consequences in terms of what that meant in terms of characterising the First World War. Essentially, had Lenin not won that debate inside the Bolshevik Party, as I said before, either the led to a split inside the Bolshevik Party between those who stuck with the revolutionary tradition that actually stuck with the interests of the working class, and that would massively weaken the Bolshevik Party, or in fact, I don't think the October insurrection would have been possible. Now, one of the essential problems which really placed having really won that debate, having won the argument that workers really had to seize power, the next task really that Lenin faced was stopping the workers from trying to seize power too soon. So you no sooner won in principle the notion that workers needed to seize power, than he actually had to prevent a too speedy seizure of power. The reason is very simple. Far from being a putschist, Lenin's argument was that until the Bolsheviks have won the majority in the Soviets, amongst the workers and amongst the soldiers, it it might be possible in certain centres like Petrograd, which actually represented the most advanced parts of the working class, because it's having the biggest concentration, the deepest revolutionary tradition and so forth. It might be possible to seize power in one or two key cities inside Russia, but it would not be possible to maintain and hold power without the backing of the broadest masses. And therefore, it was essential, having won it in principle, was to campaign inside the working class, amongst the peasantry, amongst the soldiers, and amongst the oppressed nationalities, for the necessity for workers' power. And until such a point as the majority had been won over, and then and only then would it be possible, or would it be then correct to go forward to the insurrection. Now the problem is that although it sounds very simple to say that you have to wait until you have one broad agreement. Everybody goes out with their leaflets, with their papers, they go to work, they go into the units of the army, they go onto the land, they encourage self-activity, and the workers are encouraged to strike the 8-hour day, there's discipline in the form, they're keeping them out of as many instances, there's democratisation of the, of the soldiers, getting rid of the officers or controlling the officers. The peasants actually being encouraged to seize the land, to set up land committees. Sounds very simple in a way to agitate and agitate for the continuation of the struggle, but constantly explaining the context of that. You can't trust the provisional government, you can't trust the Menshevik and social revolutions. But in reality, it doesn't develop as simply as that. It doesn't develop as simply as that precisely because of the unevenness inside the working class itself, that there are different traditions, a different dynamic in terms of the workers' own struggle, but also a different dynamic of the soldiers. Because one thing which is quite clear in the revolutionary process inside Russia is actually because soldiers don't go to work, aren't collected in the same way that workers aren't disciplined by the production process in the way that workers are, that once they actually won over to the idea that there had to be a seizure of power, didn't see why they shouldn't do it straight away. And of course, when you have the government, which the soldiers do, then actually, you do have the government, you've got the officers under control, you've shot a few of them, you're actually telling them what to do. Why not simply go ahead and seize power? Why wait the way that Lenin is talking about? Equally, the workers in Petrograd were much more highly organised, much more politicised, much more advanced than even the workers in Moscow, never mind in outlying areas in places like Siberia and so on and so forth. And therefore, the tension reproduced inside the Bolshevik Party, which of course was the party which organised the soldiers and the workers throughout Russia, the tension between those workers and those soldiers who arrived at the conclusion that the seizure of power was necessary, compared with those who were actually under the pressure of people who hadn't got that far. That unevenness was reproduced inside the party itself. And then one of those dangerous crash points in the period between February and October was precisely at the point when the soldiers, in particular in Petrograd, and also the workers, thought they shouldn't wait any longer. In fact, they got to the stage of saying that this bloody patiently explaining that Lenin goes on for is really a load of codswallop. It's actually really preventing us from doing what they told us we have to do, which is actually to make the insurrection. And of course there's an objective reason for it, because the provisional government was intensely aware of the way in which the Bolsheviks were winning in influence, that they were independent of the capitalist class, and were actually becoming increasingly clear, that's what the Bolsheviks were talking about when they seizure of power. What the provisional government did was to attempt to disband and send to the front the most revolutionary Bolshevik soldiers. And you can imagine it, you're part of a regiment, the first machine gun regiment in Petrograd, organised by the Bolsheviks, followed the leadership of the Bolshevik party, and suddenly Kerensky says you've got to go to the front. And the only reason to send you to the front is to prevent you from being able to defend the revolution. Under those circumstances, what happened on June the 18th. The first machine gun regiment simply said, we are not going. Very, very important that they said that they wouldn't go, but they said, not only are we not going, they decided to organise a demonstration, an armed demonstration in the beginning 14th of July. In fact, the Bolshevik Party itself, the military organisation of the Bolshevik Party actually called for basically called for insurrection. This is what they wrote. Comrades, well, if you read this, I think you'd agree that it's a call for insurrection. This is on the Bolshevik soldiers' paper. Comrades, enough of sacrificing ourselves for the welfare of the bourgeoisie. The time has come not to sleep but to act. Comrades, chase the bourgeoisie from power. And if they cry, war to complete victory, away to the front of the home, down lot of them. All of us are worn out by this awful war, which has already taken away the lives of millions, which has made millions crippled, and which has brought with its unheard of poverty, destruction, and hunger. Wake up, whoever is asleep. The SRs and the Mensheviks want to fool you. I appeal to you to be ready at any time to be called to counter-revolution. It stalks an SP prospect led by Khanov and Rodzianko. Still the Black Hundreds will come out, but you, comrades, with all your strength, protect the freedom that has been won. All power must pass into the hands of the workers, soldiers and peasants. Remove from power the bourgeoisie and all its sympathisers. Hail all power to the Soviet workers and soldiers' deputies. Now, it's not surprising that given that kind of leadership from the Bolshevik soldiers' paper, that the soldiers themselves and the workers who they went to appeal to join the demonstration at the beginning of July thought that that is exactly what they ought to do, which is to seize power. At the same time that the soldiers were arguing that, and actually beginning to do it by going on an armed